Officially live. I'm so excited to dive into another pre-symposium panel. So this is the lead up to our executive symposium in a little over a week on the topic implementing meaningful change within your organization. So if you're watching this and you're living in the Austin area, or if you're going to be in the Austin area next week, I'd highly encourage you to come to the executive symposium. We're going to host it at Ferrari. We're going to have a great time. It'll be from 5 to 8 p.m. But the pre-symposium panel brings three great leaders together who are going to be at the event to share their thoughts, their insights, their perspectives on what they find to be effective on the topic. In this case, it is implementing meaningful change within your organization. So we've got Mike, we've got Anya, we've got Annie. Mike, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. It's great to be here, Garrett. So my name is Mike Cilla. I am currently the Vice President of People Operations Planning and Systems at Central Health, which is the Travis County Hospital District. So we're a great organization. We provide the safety net population with affordable healthcare, equitable healthcare. I've been here 2 years, and really my remit has been to create a full center of excellence here on the people team and support pretty much hyper growth over the last 2 years. And I'm really excited to discuss more about all the modernization and change, meaningful change that my team has helped implement here since I've been here.
Very nice. Anya, how about you?
Awesome. Thanks for having us. My name is Anya Bokeria, and I'm the VP of Corporate Operations and Compliance at a boutique fitness franchise concept called Body 20. Been here about 3 years, and corporate operations houses our HR function as well as our systems and tools. So I like to say that I play in the operations space as well. Compliance is all about getting buy-in, and I think that creating meaningful change is definitely about creating buy-in on the front end as well. So excited to dive into that.
Very nice. And Annie, how about you?
Hi, I'm Annie Wu. I'm the Vice President for Customer Success. I'm based out of Austin, Texas, and I work for Dusty Robotics. We are a construction tech company that helps accuracy and quality on construction projects through robotic layout. So picture a wireless inkjet driving around and printing your layout, telling you where walls, pipes, electric, all of that go right on the floor.
Very cool. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they're there, their expectations meet reality. And when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. So we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves to their teams. And one of the ways that we build community is we put on these executive symposiums to create a space, a safe space for leaders to share their challenges and be open about their vulnerabilities and just recognize that they're not alone and have other leaders who can relate to what they're going through. So let's dive into the topic. Topic for today, implementing meaningful change within your organization. I really wanted to stress the word meaningful because I think most organizations recognize that change needs to happen, especially with how fast and things just with how fast technology and just new opportunities are emerging, whether it be global or domestically or from a technological perspective or from AI, whatever it may be. I think the really important word to emphasize is meaningful because so often so many organizations stumble in their efforts to initiate change because they lacked the meaningfulness of they lacked whether it be a clear vision, explaining the why, gathering feedback, understanding what's going on in the organization. For whatever reason, there was something that just wasn't meaningful about the change initiative being attempted, and ultimately it fell flat, cost the company a ton of money, and maybe even forced them to go back to the drawing board and go back to the old thing that they were doing, which just set them back maybe many years because it's almost like the boy who cried wolf. If you've got someone to finally buy into change and then the change doesn't work and you're like, we scrapped it, we're going back. You're almost reinforcing bad behaviors to say, cool, if we sabotage this thing, we might be able to go back to the old way of how it was working. So I would love to kick off this question, which is, how can we ensure that when we implement change within our organization, that it truly is, in fact, meaningful? Who wants to go first?
Well,
Sorry.
I've been at startups a long time. It's kind of my sweet spot, and been doing it since 2004. So I think one of the things that we heard kind of probably when I was midway through my career is like when Facebook was, and Mark Zuckerberg said, you have to move fast and break things. And I like how you framed up like implementing meaningful change because things like that is, and when we say things like that as leaders, it's not just about the values that we stand behind, but also context is super important. And the intention, and we all, I think, know the story of kind of how they went through some pitfalls and like how to come back on track. But I've seen that too. And so a lot of it is just learning how to balance that fast growth. And especially now with AI and the speed at which products can be released, you have to balance that growth with the stability of the company as it matures out of the startup phase. And still encouraging that speed over perfection and accepting it, but also prioritizing learning faster and iterating. And so I think that's one of the lessons I've learned in implementing change is like it's not just about moving fast and breaking things, it's about moving fast with intention and managing the chaos in that to avoid maybe some mistakes of tech companies that have come before us. Mike, you were going to say something, and I'd love your perspective because it's a different industry.
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on your toes either. I think what you said about the why is really the most important part about meaningfulness, right? Connecting that why back, because meaningfulness is going to be subjective in the sense that, it's going to be different for everyone. All the different stakeholders are going to have their different why. And, it's tough because a lot of change does disrupt, old ways of doing things when you're talking about process improvement, new technology, new systems, AI, obviously hot topic as well. But I think before the change effort begins, it's taking a step back, as the folks who are leading change and trying to be as empathetic as possible to all the stakeholders who you might disrupt, right, or impact. And that's tough to do because there's a balancing act of, yes, we want to anticipate and empathize and understand what, the impact that is going to occur. But also we need to balance that with the fact that there's an impetus, right? There's a reason why, there's also a why behind the change in general. But you've got to be able to be mindful, thoughtful. Communication obviously is super important. Getting ahead of that. The last thing you ever want is to have change be a surprise. And then just trying to bake in as much empathy in the process as you can, so that you can get some champions as part of the process, which I'm sure we'll get further into as we all discuss it.
It's interesting. What a great segue to like, I was having a thought, a reaction to Annie, yours, the context and then the communication, Mike, that you mentioned is so important to communicate kind of where this is coming from, why this is even happening. And then I think just a step further from the psychology of change and people, really engaging the people who are the kind of more boots on the ground stakeholders to build relationships and trust with them and listen to them about their ideas and potentially be willing to go back to the drawing board and implement some of the ideas that they've now brought to the surface as possible concerns or things, kind of on a more granular level that maybe weren't considered with the initial change rollout. I think that people generally are more resistant to being changed than they are to change. So if they're part of that process and they see that their feedback has actually been reflected into kind of the plan, the implementation, I think your buy-in chances are a lot greater to successfully carry it forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, Garrett, in the beginning, you mentioned like if you're implementing change so fast that you have to go backwards and fix things, like sometimes that's okay. Going backwards can still be progress if you're going back to the point in time of realizing where did we maybe make a misstep in this strategy. And now, like Anya said, like we're taking into consideration what our employees are telling us. That's one of the jobs of leaders is to listen to that and not just say it's my way or the highway, but like, hey, this is the direction that we think we should go in. Here's why, to Mike's point. And if we have to go back to the drawing board, that's okay. Progress can be made even if you have to take a moment to stop or go backwards and then restart again.
Yeah.
Man, y'all give me so much to work with. I love this. This is awesome. Anya, what a quote. I wrote it down immediately because I thought it was so fascinating. People are resistant to being changed, not to change itself.
Mm-hmm.
What an interesting concept.
I think
I don't
so.
know if I've heard it put that way, but I feel like now that I hear it, I'm like, man, that is so true. Like people, I think conscientiously can acknowledge that change can happen for sure. But when it requires them to actually make the change, I do think that's like the biggest. I mean, how often do we hear, let's say you got a CTO that's like, we're going to implement this new software. It's going to save us, $1 million a year. It's a no-brainer from a business standpoint. The C-suite signs off on it. Everyone says, huzzah, we support you in your technology transformation. And then all of a sudden he's like, cool, we're going to sunset the old software in 30 days. Only 10% of you are on the new software. Let's get started. And then all of a sudden sunset day happens and a bunch of people are ticked off because they're like, whoa, I thought you were doing this thing over there, saving us millions of dollars, but it didn't impact the way I do work. It's like, well, we all have to be bought into this new thing if we're actually going to reap the rewards of said savings. So I think this concept of people don't like being changed. So I guess, can I ask a real quick clarifying question on that, Anya? You touched on it before, but maybe just could you reiterate it a little bit more and give some more clarifying concepts? What can we do to then make it less challenging, I guess, in the change process? Does that question make sense? Like, what can we do to make it less people less resistant to change?
I think Annie just touched on it just a minute ago, where she said, as leaders, our job is to listen. I think it's listen more than speak. And typically, I feel like leaders feel a certain amount of pressure to have things very ironed out so that they can show that like this decision was not made rashly. We have done our work, we've done our research, and here's how buttoned up it is, and here's the implementation plan. Missing that step of getting buy-in on the front end rather than kind of building that trust plane as you fly it. So it's just relationships and trust. And I think that starts with listening and truly implementing some feedback and like throw a bone in every once in a while. If there's something that is not worth the battle, but you know that it would have meaningful impact on the people who are being affected, being willing to be flexible enough to make this a win-win for everybody, even if it means, defining progress not as linear, but as kind of being willing to go back to the drawing board from the beginning. And then from the leadership side, I think it's just defining that from the beginning for yourself so that you know that that is not a failure and that is not shouldn't be a point of contention, that from the beginning, you know that this is part of the plan is to kind of go back and then take two steps forward with that information once you can. But how to build relationships and trust, I mean, man, that's the art of it, right? Like that, it just depends. It's know your people, listen to your people, care about what they care about. Interested is interesting, right? They don't want to, it's there. I've got tons of puns and quotes and, from my teaching days, it's, they don't care what you know unless they know that you care.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just starting with the relationships. I think that's the best way to package it.
Oh yeah, Annie or Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, that's one of my favorite quotes too. And I think it's so true. Like as leaders, taking the humble approach of like we are where we are because of our wisdom and our ability to see strategy, but it's we're there for the people, and we're there to listen to them and to lead with clarity and show that we care about them so that they know and can trust that we can not only care about them, but can deliver results for the business with them, through the team. And I started my conversation with a quote of like, move fast and break things. And I think that represents kind of an old way of thinking, particularly in the tech industry. And I think now there's an understanding more of like speed versus stability, and move fast will often a call for urgency to avoid things like analysis paralysis can really, you have to be mindful of the people and the systems and the interdependencies, because breaking things can lead to that dysfunction and it can lead to lost credibility. And ultimately now while you're thinking you're disrupting and being innovative, what you're actually doing is creating a team around you that doesn't trust your decision making. So for leaders, making good decisions is such a great way to build trust. Unfortunately, the best way to learn how to make a good decision is to make a bad one. So there's some nuance to that too.
Annie, the big word I wrote down when I heard you say that was accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Like it seems like what you're describing is what's so critical is that mistakes happen. By the way, as businesses, as we implement any new change, they're experiments. We're like scientists. We're like tinkering with beakers and little flame things and trying to see what will work and what won't work. I'm just thinking about high school chemistry days. But the point I'm getting at is like, it's all an experiment. We think this could work if we do this, 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 and this. It may not work. our hypotheses may not come to fruition. Our hypotheses might even be better than what we had ever had imagined. But what's really critical is that we talk about accountability, because, and I love that you bring up Facebook. Facebook seems like a really good example. I mean, obviously, you know, however many years ago they changed their name to Meta because they thought the metaverse was going to be like the next big thing. Now they're spending like hundreds of millions of dollars on like AI software engineers because they think AI is going to be the next big thing. And I would imagine that if I were a team member on the Meta team who's like, cool, we're all in on the meta space, the metasphere, the metaverse, all the things, like this is the future. We changed our company's name for it, for crying out loud. And then, you know, all of a sudden, maybe the interest level wasn't as strong as they would have hoped for. And now all of a sudden, hundreds of millions of dollars getting poured into AI. If you're working on the metaverse, you're like, where do I fit in this future situation? Like, how comfortable do I feel about where I'm at moving forward? And I think if, you know, the executive team is like, well, there was blame to be passed out all around. You know, we had ideas, we tried different things. If there's not a singular person that can say, we messed up, we thought this would work out, we need to backtrack, but this is going to work in this way, and this is why we believe it should work. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the role accountability plays, and why do you think some organizations or some leaders struggle with taking on that accountability when it comes to maybe a failed change experiment?
Are you asking me or the group?
I'm asking the group.
I don't
Anyone
want to
can answer.
hog the whole time.
No. Yeah, anyone can answer that
I think
question.
it's lack of humility, which is another, you mentioned being a humble leader too, Annie, is like, I think it's lack of humility. I think they're fine being accountable to the wins and to change and to progress and to other people's work, right? I think where the struggle happens is when they have to be accountable to what you mentioned, Garrett, to a failed attempt. And that requires a certain level of humility and being able to say, I was wrong or this didn't work. And then not just I'll come up with a better solution, but like being willing to co-create plan B with your team and taking them along on that, uh, process, I guess. So even the initial question of like how to implement meaningful change, I think we have to take a step back and go, before we try to implement this change, how involved were the people that really should have been involved in creating what this change is going to be? Or was it just trickle down? This is what it is. And that, I think the conversation goes really differently. So, if you are going to just take the reins and kind of dictate change, then you better have a good dose of humility to be able to say, this is why it didn't work, if and when it doesn't.
And I think, like, to add to that point of like trying to prevent things from breaking that shouldn't break, context matters so much. Being clear about what done looks like, being clear about what roles and responsibilities are. And if you're going to say something like, build fast and break things, like define what's safe to break and what's not, so that people are clear on their roles. Like, okay, we can break internal tools, but not customer trust. We can ship experiments for beta testing, but we can't fulfill half-built promises. We can test assumptions, but we cannot skip over consent, privacy, or support things that really matter the most to our customers. And I think that that's kind of where the accountability is. And I think that's where a lot of leaders maybe move too fast and miss spending the time to define exactly who's doing what. And while it may be clear to you about what something like, build fast and break things means, it could mean something completely different if you're not having that conversation with your team, because there's nuance. And, I had a mentor tell me once, like, a lot of times the leaders, we go and we say, hey, get me an apple. And then someone comes back with a green apple and you're like, no, I want a red organic apple. And they come back with that, like, no, I want a red organic, envy apple with a bite taken out of it and a worm coming out. Like, that was such a powerful moment for me. And like the importance of creating that context down to the most detailed level that you absolutely need with your team, so that they trust you. They know that, like, I'm clear on what I need to do. I'm clear on what good looks like, and I know exactly how to be successful. And that trust is built in those contextual moments.
I'd add this too. I'd say all this is great. First off, I want to say Anya and Annie, we almost share the same leadership playbook because I have always espoused how important it is, and I try to live it every day to care on a genuine personal level about my people. Like that's the work. You can't phone that in. So hearing that from both of you really resonates with me. And then if we just take a step back on like this is a great example on move fast and break things. Right? I'm not sure if that was ever Facebook's vision, mission statement, or part of their cultural values, but it sure was a really sticky internal employer branding, nomenclature that definitely stuck around. But those are the values, right? I think if you can bake in, if you're an organization, and look, like Garrett, you said, every organization goes through change. I mean, in fact, when you think about like lean manufacturing and Toyota, right? Like they've literally baked that into their operating modality to constantly anticipate continuous improvement, and that is change. And so I do think there's like an element of cultural values. Like, do we have the values that allow us to bring in everyone all the way from the top down to the front lines, across the org to be empowered to speak up and to be involved, in the process when there is a change that's coming? Are the values the opposite way where leaders can hide accountability, right? And it doesn't promote humility. I'm a huge advocate of that as well. In fact, one of the things I always think, as a leader, so first of all, there was another thing that was said too was just listening way more than you actually speak. I've noticed that, as a leader, you have a team meeting, it's a really, tough topic. You kind of let the room sit and you feel the urge to jump in and make a decision or speak. And really, you just have to not do that, right? And I've actually had the opposite critique from direct reports in the past where they've said, well, I expect you to just make the decision and then I execute. Not, my approach is, no, you were hired. I brought you on this team. I value your expertise. It's an area that I'm not as strong as you, and I want your input. Yes, at the end of the day, it's my duty to take in as much as I can and then land on a decision and decisively direct and guide and help support the path forward. But I'm not always the one. I don't, maybe it's a place of humility where I don't feel that I should be dictating all the terms all the time.
Yeah. Do you all tell your teams like this is where I'm good? These are my strengths as a leader, and this is where I need your help, right? Because I think one of the fallacies is like we have to pretend like we're strong and we're good at everything, and we're not. Like I'm a very data-driven leader. I'm very analytical. I'm very operational, but I'm maybe not the person that you're going to put up on stage to give a last minute like rah speech to the the organization, right? I'm going to need a lot more preparation to do something like that. So I'm just curious, like how y'all like share that with your team in terms of your strengths and where you need them.
I think for sure, not just like what, your strengths are and where you want to lean on others, but even within your strengths, I think it's really important for leaders to admit fault, talk about where they were less than perfect, where they're not super happy with their own level of work or responsiveness or whatever the case may be. I think it's important for our teams to feel that perfection is not an expectation of them or of any human at work, right? That there's room for error because if you value learning, if you value growth, like it's impossible to do without some backwards traction. So I always like to share when I mess up, like however, not like forgetting about a meeting or sending an email to the wrong person or just like whatever little thing to actual big, issues that then need to be addressed. But just speaking openly about that we're allowed to do that.
I
You
love
know,
that. And I love that you called out like the double standard we set sometimes of like if you're gonna you said if you value learning growth, then it's impossible to do without some backwards traction. And I love that term backwards traction. I'm totally gonna steal that. But then we set maybe this idea that you have to be perfect and you can't make mistakes, right? You can't have both.
Yeah.
And but well said.
Perfect environment for psychological safety, Anya. I do the same, and lately these days it's been more around sort of ruminating like a day after I might have kind of acted out a little bit, right? Like another way that I've ingratiated myself with my team is I really try to be my genuine self. And I know that's a fine line that we walk too sometimes, right? Because we are the role models for professionalism and, standards of conduct, right? How we show up as leaders. And I find myself almost more often than not having to send a note the next day. the way I behaved yesterday was not my best self. And, then I usually couch it in some best practice Marshall Goldsmith coaching, or, what got you here won't get you there. Like something, a tidbit of, sort of wisdom that hopes to show exactly that I'm still working on getting better. And that is a never ending moving target, right?
All right, there's too much agreement here. I'm gonna play devil's
I know, I was like,
You're gonna stir the
There's
pot.
way too much agreement,
The
y'all.
panel.
I need to play a
No,
little
let's-
devil's advocate here.
I
So,
mean, I can share with you what I used to think.
well, here's a question that I have, because something that I'm thinking of that I think can be really hard. So there's a few things that have been said here. One, we've talked about clarifying context. We've also talked about accountability going beyond just like the mistake in a concept that we did, but also the process of getting there. So like we as CEO, or if like we're a CEO, we can't launch in a new direction, realize it was a mistake, and then say, y'all, I just went to Mount Kilimanjaro, met with my shaman. I have the new vision for where we're going. Not discussed it with anybody, but my shaman. We are able to figure this out. Like, this is where we're going. It's like, cool, you didn't talk to anybody. You just, like, had visions and went to Mount Kilimanjaro. That's cool. But, like, that had no impact and no buy-in from anybody else involved. Um, but there is a happy medium to all this, because one thing that can definitely tend to occur is people becoming comfortable with the status quo. I think a lot of times we can look at business and say, like, things are going good, things are good. Why would we need to change? Things are good. And like, maybe you got a CEO who you don't understand the pressures that she or he is facing from their board. And they look at this growth rate and they're like, yeah, if you were this type of company, that would be a fine growth rate. But because we've taken on this type of investment, we needed a growth rate that's over here. I would imagine, Annie, you could relate, especially being in a startup space. It's like, cool. Like in the venture-backed space, having a steady Eddie growth rate is good for a normal business, but VCs are trying to get to unicorn status, which means they need to see this go like a hockey stick. And anything less than that is unacceptable. And so the question I have here is, how do we balance our internal what's good enough as an employee versus an executive team's internal what's good enough, and where do we find that balancing act? Does that question make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think like understanding, okay, so if you're VC backed and you have unicorn status, you have to figure out your product market fit really quickly. You have to sell to some frogs. You're going to see some churn. You're going to learn from that, and you're going to continue to refine your ICP. Like there's a really fast learning curve that has to take place. And so there's certain things though that, we're going to want to celebrate with the caveat that we're learning from this. Like, okay, some churn happened. Why did it happen? Was it within our control? Was it not? Like, is this related to product? Do we need to develop a certain feature? Like, there's a whole bunch of questions you're going to ask as you're looking through that data and talking to customers to get to that unicorn status. But you don't want to be there forever. Like, at some point, you're going to drop the VCs and you're going to be in charge of your own destiny. And I think so. It's just like a matter of like timing and knowing that that phase has a start and an end, and that you're going to shift to something else. But at that point, now we're building upon the wisdom that we've gained versus continuing to exhibit the same behavior from unicorn days that we now need to drop in favor of stability and more steady Eddie growth, as you shared. So
I think another thought is, as it relates to kind of that balance, is trusting the overall process, to know that, like, there's a concept in pedagogy, or maybe it's like in more curriculum and development, I guess, chunking. So breaking whatever the big change is into kind of smaller wins, because momentum has a way of then kind of exciting everybody and getting more, kind of returning maybe some of the resistance into buy-in when you can see small, meaningful change. And it might not be exactly what the board wants to see quite yet, but that's what allows everybody else to get on board. And so the timing element, right, is like, how can I create small wins that build on each other, that are actually kind of consequential? I think that's a good way to just, gain momentum. And then before you know it, you're actually implementing some of the more meaningful, kind of impactful stuff. And usually it has to go in that order anyway, right? There's going to be some kind of prerequisites in order to do the big things.
I know you
But
want to definitely it, but I can't help but agree with both Anya and Ann. No, I am a huge fan of the virtuous cycle of self-efficacy on the individual level. And I've never really thought about how it applies to the organizational level, but that's true too, right? So you critically prioritize what are the milestones that make sense in a logical sequence of order of operations, and then you highlight those wins. And to Anya's point, that'll help getting those small wins, if you will, low-hanging fruit, whatever those things on the roadmap that they are priorities, but they're not necessarily the long haul. You get those going and you can actually celebrate some of the wins. I think you're going to get more people on board and help drive the change further through into adoption. But awesome points. I never really reflected back on how that virtuous self-efficacy model could actually be organizational as well as individual.
I think too, like, as we're going through and we're creating these projects, these milestones, these tasks, like we don't know all the answers. Like we know we may need to get to Z. We know that we need to double our revenue in a year. Well, what's the first step to that? Sometimes you only know the first couple steps as a leader, and you've got to trust your instinct on that and know and communicate. Okay, this is where we're going to go. This is what we need to do next. You don't always have every single step from A to Z, and sometimes people want that, and you can't you can't give it to them because they're along for the ride too. There is risk to, when you're like at a startup, for example, and you've got to do that. And I think, yes, we're going to celebrate the milestones that we do achieve, but I also want to celebrate we delayed our launch because we prioritize preserving customer trust.
yeah.
Or we held space for an internal debate that surfaced some critical risks to our business that we weren't thinking of. So, that spirit and those values, I think that you brought up earlier, Mike, like that is super, super important. And, back to my point earlier too, like you don't need to know all the answers to start moving forward. And your team should know that. I think the challenge and the nuance in that is like, psychological safety is like sometimes admitting where we don't know things, but it's also knowing when to stop talking. Because there may be things that you're worried about and thinking about as a leader. You should not be surfacing in the room in front of your team because they may internalize that even more than you and get frightened of the future and leave, right? And so like drawing that line and like making things safe to speak up and admit mistakes, but not so much that you appear as a leader incompetent or unsure, right? That I find that personally challenging.
So, this is interesting. I want to bring back this point. How do we bubble up to our executive team? How do we bubble up to our CEO? We have a scenario where maybe context wasn't clarified. So like it was brought up earlier before, this concept of like, oh, bring me an apple. Then a green apple's brought over. And like, no, bring me a red apple. Like, no, bring me a red envy apple that's got a caterpillar in it or whatever. Like, there are ramifications for not clarifying the specifics of what your desired outcome are. And those ramifications manifest themselves in reduced morale and reduced appetite for change. Because if I was told, bring this person an apple, and I worked really, really hard on finding a green apple, and I brought my CEO this green apple, and they took that green apple and threw it in the trash and said, no, I need a red apple that's like an envy apple. And they're like, dang, I really worked hard on that green apple. Okay, fine, I'll go back and get a red envy apple. And then you bring a red envy apple in, and the CEO takes that red envy apple and say, closer, but I want it with a bite out with a like caterpillar on it, throws in the trash. Like eventually you become more and more demoralized because your work keeps getting thrown in the trash and not being utilized. And so then eventually you're like, I'm just going to phone it in. I'm going to do the bare minimum. I'm not going to put a lot of energy, time, or effort into this because I have a decent chance of this getting thrown out anyways. Why work so hard on this? And then like as the executive team, then all of a sudden we want people to kick into hyper gear because we're ready to like make a full scale change of this giant cruise ship, and it's not easy to turn a cruise ship on a dime. So how do we bubble up to our executive team like, hey, can you please clarify exactly what you want from me and what we're trying to achieve here? Because I worked really hard on this thing, and now that I understand what you're looking for, that's totally fine. I want to continue working hard on this, but it is a little demoralizing to see my work getting thrown out in the trash. How do you bubble that up? Like, do you bubble that up? Is it not even worth bubbling up? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think that's the question that you have to ask yourself as an employee is how well received will this conversation be, and is it worth having? Because sometimes the answer is no. I think there's a lot of times that leaders would prefer to just start over and find someone that would know that I meant the red apple, and they don't care that there's going to be a gap in employment and, you know, onboarding, and they will take an opportunity to move along if they don't feel like it's a good fit. And then there's the leaders who will, you know, listen and are, again, maybe humble enough to be managed up. And those are the conversations that I would definitely encourage being had. But I used to think that, like, you know, I came a little bit from like a place of, I guess it's that HR like self-right, like you have to fight for what you want in the workplace and what works for you. And if you need more clarity, then you should stand up and ask for it. That's on you. And then I think from the psychological safety element, it's not always worth your emotional toll to try to convince someone else that this is an important consideration in the workplace. You know, they're adults and sometimes they're not open to change. And so that's what you have to, I think, weigh is this something that is worth for me? You know, is this a hill that's worth it to die on? Or do I just seek out the information that I need some other way and leave out the part about how it made me feel and what it's contributing to long term for the company or for me as an employee, and more just like, here's what I need to make this project work and stay firm on that. But that's the hard part. Yeah. And hopefully we all have leaders and are the types of leaders that would be open to those types of conversations and even take them and go, oh man, where else am I doing that I didn't realize I was doing? It's a blind spot. But
Well,
yeah, I think
and
it's
I think
missing.
a lot of CEOs are guilty of that, but the way it manifests itself is the employees don't say anything up to the CEO, and then the CEO decides, oh, we should change, or things are less productive, we're not getting as much out of this team or that team or whatever. And then they make the change, and everyone to the CEO's face is like, oh yeah, boss, I'm on board for sure. Two thumbs up, and then no one does it. And the CEO's like head scratching, like, what's going on here? Like,
Yeah.
how could there like what? Everyone's telling me everything's good and they're on board and they like the new ideas, and then no one does anything that we discussed, and like things take forever to get done, and like now we're not making any progress here. And I don't know, I feel like most CEOs would prefer to have, if they could handle it from an ego perspective, the hey, this is when you do this and you take my work and you throw it in the trash and tell me to go back to the drawing board, like this is what it does to my work output. Like, please give me the clarity I need to be successful. I'm going to put in more great effort here. But if we're not aware of that and we don't proactively say that as an executive, our people are eventually going to just phone it
Yeah.
in. We're going to be like,
But it's
oh,
it's
wow,
it's
I don't
also
know why I
actions,
didn't.
Garrett, not just like saying. I'm sure they would prefer that kind of clarity and they would prefer that people come to them when they
Yeah.
feel that way. But the question is, are your actions on a day-to-day actually making you an approachable person that people want to come talk to? And, you know, do you just have a sign on the door that says the door is always open on your closed door? Or is your door actually always open? And that's where I think, you know, people are like, well, but no one said XYZ. I think we hear this in HR realm a lot, right? Like nobody's come to me with those complaints. Well, but why haven't they come to you? It's not that there's not complaints. Like, let's dig deeper into what it could possibly be that, you know, what kind of a environment, what kind of cultural values are clear within the company, even if they're not written down. Yeah.
I've always tried to never be the leader who dings someone for asking for specificity or ask for clarity. And I always try to take a step back after I've kind of said, you know, okay, this is the deal. Let's go to work. Did I do enough to provide the clarity that they're going to need to get that done? Right. The onus is on me, but I also try to provide enough of a psychologically safe space that my team knows they're never going to be dinged because they need more specificity, or because it likely, to be honest, it's on me because I didn't think it through the way that they will once they're on the front lines involved in the work. So yeah, couldn't agree more with that as well.
Oh, I
So
think we got some
sorry, Garrett.
disagreement here, at least
I
with
know you want
Andy's side.
disagreement.
I know. I think Annie might disagree with this, and I'll give a dissenting point for Annie on this one. But where do we find the caveat between, I don't know, having all the structure in the world? Like, let's say, and I see this happen all the time, especially when you see someone go from like a big organization, like let's say Walmart. Someone goes from Walmart, and now some startup has hired this person from Walmart to lead their new whatever division. And it's still a startup. And this person from Walmart is used to all the accoutrements of a big organization, executive assistants, lavish offices, all the very clear, this is what we're working towards, steady Eddie growth, that sort of stuff. And the startup's like, you need to be scrappy, you need to be resourceful, you need to figure it out. And so, like, there's times where you might need to say, like, hey man, I need to just figure this one out. I don't know how we're gonna get there, but like this is why we brought you in to get this job done. I don't know. That's where, but I think there's this gap of like some people who, especially like who are perfectionists that like want everything to be pristine and perfect, need to have every question answered before they can even get start working on something. And there are other people that are like, give me the high level skinny and I'll get after it. There's probably the truth is probably in between, but I don't know. Annie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. I've seen that too, where, I mean, it kind of goes back to like, are you hiring the right person for the job and the mission? Um, Arguably, like someone who's worked at large enterprise companies with a lot of support, isn't is going to have a really challenging time at a startup where you're going to have to run your own analysis, you're going to have to create your own workflows, you're going to have to talk to customers, you're going to be a player coach and like be swapping your hats out all day long. Um, I mean, I think really the conversations at any stage though are like, what are the outcomes that we're driving to? What are the targets for the business? Do we know, okay, we need to double our revenue in a year. Okay, so how are we going to get there? What are the levers that we're going to pull? And so we know what that outcome is, but we have to get specific about our strategy now. And that's kind of where those conversations come into play and saying like, okay, this is the direction that we need to go in. Here's how I think we're going to get there. What am I not seeing? Inviting people to poke holes in it and solve the problem with you. I made a mistake early on in my leadership career where, we were having some challenges with delivering a product that our customers really felt was meeting their needs. And we were releasing a lot of new features, but everything else that we had done before was kind of half baked and it was getting to a point of frustration. And so, me with my team of customer service folks that talk to the customers thousands of times a day, put together a presentation, took it off to product, said, this is what we need to do. And then the whole meeting, the product team poked holes in our ideas and just like tore it to shreds. And I was so frustrated. And I called at this time, I had like an executive coach and I called them and was like, so pissed. Like, I'm tired of this. I'm trying to do this work to move the organization forward. And I just got crapped all over. And she listened to me and then she goes, well, this is your fault. I was like, excuse me? And it was because I didn't involve people in solving the problem and defining the problem. I just brought to them the solution. And so talking about like buy-in and people, in the beginning of the conversation, we talked about like that change and are people ready for change? Well, one of the ways that you help them get there is bringing them into the problem, not into the solution. Because I think we all kind of have that ego of like, if we're just presented the solution, we're going to find reasons why it may not work. But if we're talking together and aligned on the problem and talking about the outcome we're trying to achieve, like it's going to be a lot easier to get that change done.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Mike, Anya, Annie, this has been a great pre-symposium panel. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. If you're watching this and you're like, man, I want to meet these three great leaders, come to our executive symposium next week, August 7th, 5 to 8 p.m. at Ferrari. We'll be discussing implementing meaningful change within your organization. Everybody, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day.